The family grant idea proposed by government has been met with some resistance. Civil society groups say this grant will exclude millions of South Africans who currently qualify for the 350 Rand grant. There is some expectation that Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana will propose that the COVID-19 social relief of distress grant be terminated and replaced with a family grant. Now, former statistician-general of South Africa, Dr. Pali Lehohla, has written an opinion piece on the matters and joins us now. Dr. Lehohla, very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time. The country is really waiting with bated breath to hear some of the big announcement that will come from the midterm policy statement this afternoon. The proposed family poverty grant, some have spoken of it and criticized it, and some have really spoken in support of it, saying that it's excellent in theory but problematic in implementation. What's your take?
Yes, I think the problem we have in South Africa is while we have policies like nobody can say don't eliminate poverty, don't provide good life for all, a better life for all, nobody can argue against those. The problem is how those things are applied in the reality of this country. And people don't take enough time to understand that reality, which they are a product of. For instance, the family grant cannot work. In fact, Treasury surprises me because in 2018, the pensions actually changed the act, changed elements of the act to ensure that orphans get the pension part of their deceased parents. And in that, what is very important is that there is no need to trace the surviving spouse. They understood this particular problem that we have in the country. Now, to try and grant a family, give a family grant, who is the head of the family? Who is the head of the household? The situation is very, very fluid in the main in the country around what family means. And I don't think the guys at Treasury ever took time to think about what the family structure in the black community as destroyed by apartheid is. Yet, they are a product of this. So this kind of situation that is very arrogant and doesn't take into account the kind of situation on the ground is not acceptable. Not only the family grant will be small and cover very few people, but by nature is not implementable in the kind of situation we have in South Africa. I mean, 60% of the fathers say they are married to 30% of the mothers. And another statistics that is very important in home affairs is only in 60% of birth certificates, the name of the father is not there. So what kind of anybody who doesn't understand the implication of that for allocating resources must be mad. And unfortunately, it looks like Treasury is mad in this case.
Professor Thuli Madonsela, as well as the University of Stellenbosch, have really tried to go into the depth, the details here, asking some very imperative and complex questions that need to be answered around policies. Talk us through some of those scenarios and complexities, especially with questions around the strategies that can work and how they would work, and the important considerations government would have had to make, policies which have had to be in place already before this conversation comes to the foreground.
Yes, Professor Thuli Madonsela from the Social Justice Chair, as a Social Justice Chair at Stellenbosch, has actually taken time, I think, inspired by her work as the public protector and looking at the kinds of situations she has to address, like Gogo, the Musa that she talks about. That Musa was born, she couldn't go to school, she became a mother. Her children were also subjected to not going to school. She had to understand then what kind of policies, what are the impacts of policies, And in fact, you have to understand the impact of policies long before you implement the policy. And that's what she's all about. How do you actually bring systems design thinking and systems design in policy making, in government? She has been inspired by scientists and engineers that they can land an Apollo on the moon, and they will have designed everything to make sure that that lands there. Now, that kind of science is possible and probable in social science. And in fact, at the birthday party of the Archbishop Tutu, Dalai Lama has and himself established a school or an institute whereby behavioral patterns amongst people can scientifically be determined. And therefore, there's nothing untoward, therefore, to bring the science practice of modeling in planning. In fact, many countries do that, except South Africa that doesn't model that much. And what we do is we'll hear from the MTF and UPS will be 2-year cycles or 3-year cycles that are driven by finance and not by deep science planning and impact. I don't know whether we'll hear anything about employment and poverty, things that are long-term and have long-term consequences on society. It is those kinds of things that we have to put in the space, asking the question, how will a person who is born today look like when they are 70? It therefore means that you have to have the tools that provide projections in this uncertain world and the range of possibilities, and then work with that range of possibilities.
In providing,
it's not acceptable that this country cannot have that.
In covering and providing some of those projections, questions have also been asked around how much it should be and who specifically it should cover.
Well, those are things that should be available to society to discuss. Who should bear the burden? Let me say that the poor for 300 years have borne the burden, and the blacks of development in South Africa for 300 years. They continue as the poor to bear the burden 28 years from now. It is clear that these burdens have to be discussed and allocations on those and compensatory mechanisms put in place. The policies do so, say so. But the extent to which that is solved is hardly seen more lately. Of course, there have been housing, free housing, and all those kinds of things that are important. But there are fundamental things where we miss the plot. And it is in arguing how do we look ahead of ourselves. If you take a man like Van der Bijl, who started Eskom in 1923, he was clear around what energy should be. It must be accessible and affordable to industry. And that was the industrialization strategy of South Africa. And then from there, it spawned many other things. We don't have that kind of thinking that Van der Bijl provided. He was recruited by Prime Minister Smuts to be his scientific advisor. He recruited him from the US as a South African. And when he came here, he unfolded the system of SOEs, state-owned enterprises. And that infrastructure is what drove South Africa. That's the infrastructure we are destroying now.
Absolutely.
So without those lines of foresight, we cannot actually achieve a lot as a country.
Dr. Lehohla, what are the major issues that essentially hamper the new minister's policy direction when it comes to whatever he decides to do, especially looking at unions, at fiscal constraints, the policies themselves, the ANC, Eskom, SOEs, as you speak to?
Well, I mean, I know that we have this thing called debt to GDP ratio as a variable that has to be attended to. And unfortunately, it's the single variable that is dropped in there. They must drop unemployment in there. They must drop inequality in there. And then we go into a discussion as a country as to what kind of society and what is the national agenda. A national agenda cannot be debt to GDP ratio. A national agenda must be employment, poverty, inequality, debt to GDP ratio, interest rates. Those are the macroeconomic variables that we have to discuss. We can't say that our macroeconomic variables are threatened and not say that our country is threatened by the high levels of unemployment and inequality. So this eclectic approach to development and presuming that we can be a developmental state with this eclectic approach, we will never achieve that. So these are the myopic views that are neoliberal that we have clung to, even in the situation of COVID-19. The president says he wants different post-COVID. Different cannot come when we are only looking at a single variable such as debt to GDP ratio, and we don't look at unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Look at Busa now. It put its document to government. It says no more NHI, no more big in that document, but they say any government that doesn't take care of their business will be very dangerous government. Who do they say should attend to the poor? They are saying government shouldn't and should attend to business. And that's been the case all along. That's why business is having profit all the time. Even at a low rate of growth of 3%, business will still make profit. But the poor will never get jobs at that level. So unless we have targets and processes that move forward together as society, we are never going to have a social stability in this country. These are things that we must attend to. So the absence of long-term planning in this country, and let me sound like a broken record, and the multiple plans. I mean, South Africa, how many plans have we had? We had RDP, GIA, ASGISA, NDP, 9-point plan, 14-point plan, New Dawn and everything, slogans and plans come together, and each time there's wind, we change. A toy for the nation every 2 years cannot take this country forward.
Dr. Lehohla, before we let you go, pardon me for interrupting you there, just for the sake of time, just looking at Minister Godongwana, does the fact that he is the head of economic transformation policy for the ANC make his job more difficult or perhaps a lot easier?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't answer yes or no. I have to understand what plan is there. And in terms of the plan, the recovery and reconstruction plan that is on the table, we've modeled that, and the growth will only be at best 3.2%. And with that growth, there's not going to be change in unemployment and poverty in this country. The number of jobs will only be 2 million by 2030. So by making those projections and understanding their implications is what he should be seized with and ask the question. And Parliament must ask him the question. Mr. President and Minister of Finance, will this make South Africa better? Who loses and who gains? For that, they must ask Tulima Donsella's tools. And how are the compensation mechanisms? If we don't we are not going to ask those questions, and we clap at the end of the MTBPS, then our nation will be a nation of idiots, I must say.
Very well. Let's leave it there for now, and thank you for your time and your input. Former Statistician-General Dr. Pali Lehohla there, weighing in on the recent debates around the social assistance and relief in the context of COVID-19, the family grant, and civil society being livid as the grounds that rest on this decision need to be explored. Dr. Pali Lehohla speaking to South Africa, essentially bearing the brunt of the absence of long-term planning by government here in South Africa.